We are very lucky to have with us Mary Louise Schumacher, a veteran critic and journalist and a 2017 Nieman Fellow in Arts and Culture at Harvard University. She's currently at work on a documentary film about art critics, and she just mentioned to me that she's going to give us the first glimpse ever of some snippets from that project. And she herself, of course, you know, was the art and architecture critic at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel for more than 18 years. In today's internet environment, many communities across the US have been left without a full-time art critic. And Schumacher notes that this is occurring at a time when, in fact, the work that critics and art journalists do has never been more relevant. It's not just the art world that has changed, she says, it is that art's place in the world has changed. The planet at large is generating visual culture on a scale that is hard to fathom. She is a passionate champion of culture that connects us to human experience and to each other. And tonight she'll talk to us about how technological change has impacted our relationship with art. And we'll share some of the subjects that she's exploring in her current film project. Please join me in welcoming Mary Louise Schumacher.
Hello, everyone. I can't begin to tell you what an incredible delight and pleasure it is for me to be here. The Smithsonian museums are very special to me. They were haunts for me when I was in college, just up the road at the University of Maryland, studying art history and journalism. So I've spent a lot of time kind of staring down artworks in the halls of Smithsonian museums. And if you had asked me back then if I would ever, be speaking from one of these great museums, I would not have believed you. So I'm really very honored to be part of this lecture series. Thank you, Melissa, for that incredibly kind introduction, and to everyone here at SAM, Gloria, Stephanie, and Willie for putting me so at ease. And thank you also to Clarice Smith for supporting this kind of discussion, and to all of you for being here. So what I'd like to do tonight, just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what's ahead, is tell you about my own path to becoming an art critic at a newspaper in the Midwest, and then the forces that inspired me to research the lives and work of critics in recent years. Then I'll share some of what I've learned, which will include a couple of peeks at a documentary film that I've been working on for a very long time. And as Melissa said, no one has actually seen this footage outside of our team so far, so I'm excited about that. And then I'll share the findings of a national survey that I did of visual arts writers and critics as well. I've been asked to present for about an hour, so settle in. Okay. So, it was nearly 20 years ago, the day I found myself in an old Honda, idling beside a construction site at Lake Michigan. I was with a woman, Diane, who would become my boss, and there was something that she wanted me to see. In front of us were these surreal rib-like arches that seemed to surface from the mud. It was like one of Leonardo da Vinci's theoretical contraptions sort of come to life. Someday, Diane told me, this new building, an art museum, would be crowned with a fluttering roof. It would be a massive movable sunshade the size of a 747. Her offer to me that day was simple. Come and chronicle the metamorphosis of a city under the spell of art and architecture. It was the biggest cultural story to come along in a generation, she told me. And it would be my story if I took the job. When I got that offer to work at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, I was living in New York and had a life that felt like the one I always wanted. I was an editor-writer for a successful .com with an enviable sublet not a few feet from MoMA. I was a hard news reporter then and had carved out a promising new beat covering technology and privacy during the first online boom. What made me pick up and move to Wisconsin was the intoxicating idea of writing about art. It had never occurred to me that I could marry my love of culture to my journalism. Even then, arts writing jobs were very rare. So I tossed over the fabulous sublet for the irresistible story. When I arrived in Milwaukee, I joined a robust arts and features staff. We occupied an entire floor of a building and were flush with critics. What I discovered in Wisconsin, especially in those early years, was a fragile and at times quite rigorous cultural scene. Every now and again, conditions will coalesce in a time and a place to produce unique periods of artistic inventiveness. In fits and starts, I witnessed that in Milwaukee, a place that's known outside of our borders for beer and Joseph McCarthy, was a gathering place for artists, many of whom embrace obscurity, understanding both its limitations and its freedoms. This is a portrait of Milwaukee artists that was taken by Kevin Miyazaki several years ago to accompany a story about the art scene. As I look back, there are so many artists that inspired me, and I'd like to just briefly talk about 4. Years before the rise of the Trump voter, photographer-artists Julie Lindemann and John Scheinman documented something about malaise and rebellion in rural Wisconsin. They created knowing portraits of people who turn the nowhereness of their outposts into a stage of sorts: lawn art collectors, punk rockers, exotic dancers, and visionary artists. Long before sociologist Matthew Desmond published his Pulitzer Prize-winning Evicted, a book about housing insecurity and racial segregation in Milwaukee, artist Hyanna Bowie created a whole body of work about her just displaced nomadic childhood. It's a forensic investigation of her own family, an artistic memoir full of longing. One of her paintings, not this one, which is the size of a history painting, included the ashes of an incarcerated uncle who she had been cut off from for years. A generation before Time's Up, mosaicist Marjorie Krellick got a testosterone-fueled room full of bureaucrats to listen to her. It was not easy. She persuaded them to let her create an early form of land acknowledgement, a mural cycle for a public building inspired by indigenous beliefs about the landscape. I didn't discover Marjorie's story until just this year. She was 93 years old when I found her, and it was a reminder to me that there was always more to discover. In a place that values hard work and pragmatism, Michelle Grabner has been creating one plain-spoken mark after another for years. She's an unabashed formalist whose abstractions derive meaning from countless small acts of labor, the kinds that make the world, the stitches sewn or seeds planted. They are also not, they're almost unphotographable, Michelle's work, so these images will not do them justice. The intimate relationship between art and place became apparent to me in Wisconsin because of artists like these. I discovered how art can be, by its varied nature, a tool of progress and justice in a place. I hadn't been on the job very long when the internet began to revolutionize my work. At first, the digital turn seemed full of promise. It gave me the tools to build an entire community around what I did and to experiment with new forms of criticism, including videography. It also connected me to the larger art world discussions going on. I could get to my desk in the morning and read about what artists were doing in Cleveland or New Orleans by people who were on the ground covering it. Connective tissue began to form among arts writers across the country. Our work was suddenly in conversation. In truth, I was still finding my voice as a critic when the newsroom downsizings became routine, as journalists began their long chase of readers across the internet. When I noticed that art critics were losing their jobs nationally in the midst of all of this change, somewhere in the mid-aughts or so, it raised a lot of questions for me. How many readers, especially in the middle of America, would have a chance encounter with an art review while perusing the news, as they had for generations? What would it mean if criticism receded fully to big city publications on the coasts, or to magazines and websites for people already interested in art? What would happen to rare regional scenes like the one I knew without the catalyst of critics on the ground to make sense of them? How would criticism itself fare in these new, churning, voluminous internet seas? For as long as I could remember, the art world has been talking about the crisis of criticism. And at some point, the debates that were sort of raging on the more academic end of the field seemed to commingle with the existential concerns of mainstream media. You could not attend any kind of art world gathering without bumping into some kind of cleverly titled, but ultimately mind-numbing panel discussion about the fate of critics. When it came to the world of journalism, the opposite was sort of true. The loss of cultural writing got lost in the larger story about the overall state of media. This is when the journalist in me felt something in my gut. There was a story here. I wanted to investigate a profession that seemed to be collapsing just as I was coming into it. I wanted to grapple with what was happening to art and to media, but also what was happening to us. How was this period of change changing our relationship to art? So, I decided to make a documentary film about art critics. Now, truth be told, I had never actually done anything quite like that before, and I knew enough to know that art criticism is not exactly the most cinematic of activities, Think about what art critics do. We look at stuff, and then we go back to our keyboards and quietly contend with our experiences, right? We fall into our beds at night with laptops and exhibition catalogs and our swirling brains. It is a riveting internal life, I promise you that. But action-adventure it is not. Still, story seemed like a good antidote to all of this go-nowhere talking. And I knew these were interesting people going through something profound. So I convinced my friend, Mark Escribano, a filmmaker, to work on this project with me. We decided to call it Out of the Picture. That was almost a decade ago. When we started shooting, Jen Graves was just getting started at The Stranger in Seattle. Karolina Miranda had just left Time magazine to kind of go independent. Harag Vartanian had just invented the term blogazine for his then fledgling website, Hyperallergic. And Douglas Britt had just been elevated from a suburban bureau at one of the biggest papers in the country. As the years unfolded, a lot happened. Some of these writers would eventually gain incredible visibility and become essential voices on art. Others became marginalized, pushed out, obsolete. So let me take you into one of the sort of darker moments that we documented. It was not long after Jen had been named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. There was a new editor at The Stranger who was on Jen's case to be more fun, which Jen took to be code for less serious, maybe even less political. Jen was asked to write shorter, brighter copy, more frequent copy, and take on many more duties. These are very familiar themes for anybody who's in media today. At some point, though, it became clear to Jen that the job she once knew had been effectively eliminated, so she resigned. I was there with my camera as she said her goodbyes to artists and colleagues, as she scrolled the 982 Facebook messages that flowed in from people across the country. She told me on one of those days, as we were walking through Olympic Park outside of Seattle, that one of her goals had been to change people's lives with sentences. And she said this without the slightest bit of self-importance. I believed her, and I love that. I was there with my camera too when Jen packed up her desk as she went through catalogs that represented 11 years of looking at art in Seattle. Jen's little boy was sort of soaking up all of the emotion of the occasion and was just screaming while Jen tried to keep it together. Then Jen left the art world abruptly, and social media too. I have a 4-minute clip to show you what happened next, what this Pulitzer Prize finalist did to make a little money post our Critic life. This is just 2 days after she packed up her desk. But I have a short disclaimer for you first. So I hate it when documentary filmmakers apologize for their footage, but I feel like I want you to understand what you're about to look at. The folks here at the Smithsonian asked me if I would be willing to share some of our footage with you, but none of it has been formally edited yet. What we do have are what are called assemblies, which is when you are roughly bringing together footage to kind of look at it, and it's footage that will eventually be finessed into a scene or a trailer. So I would like for you to think about these clips as a sort of coming into the editing room with me and looking at works in progress. All right. So, but I think this will give you a sense of this particular moment in Jen's life and the kind of material that we've been looking at. All right, so here's Jen.
The first time I made a big, scary life change was when I got the letter notifying me that I was qualifying for Olympic trials in synchronized swimming. And I knew my rank, so I knew I wasn't going to make it. And I thought, well, maybe I could spend the next 4 years training for the next one. I thought, I'm not doing that. I just felt done. So I just retired after 16 years. And that was weird. This is such a big part of my identity. It took a while to unfold who I was going to be, but then I actually became a newspaper writer. Started working for the college paper. I hadn't had time for that before. This change feels like that. A lot. Why is your garbage full? Why is your garbage full? If you want to get out anger, you should do this job. This is a good job for this. Okay. Whoa. Okay. All right. It helps to not have a lot of pride. I am doing a little cleaning on the side. It's, physical work, which really lets my mind unravel, and I listen to books, and I can get myself in a quiet place where just working for myself, and I am happy when something is clean. It's a very simple, very easy win. I mean, I just know what the rules are. Like, I can clean, and I know what's clean. There's no debate about how to practice journalism in the digital age in this bathroom. I just wasn't valuable enough for them to continue employing unless I started doing other things other than the things I'd been doing for all those years and trying to work really hard at for all those years. And I felt like, wow, I'm having to make a case that I'm earning my keep, and I just refuse to make that case. And then it brings up all the things I'm angry about over all the 20 years, like all the things that you have to fight for as a journalist. Editors and publishers who are afraid of publishing certain things, or they sit on the boards of organizations you're covering, or just sketchy stuff, Sometimes it gets sketchy. And that is the kind of dirt that I'm angry about. I'm not angry about somebody's dirty toilet. This kind of dirt is very clean compared to that kind of dirt. There's a special torture in doing something that's almost the thing you really want to be doing, but not doing the thing you really want to be doing. So for me, I would far rather be cleaning than doing a $20 an hour copy editing job, or some marketing copy, or some copy that's like magazine, fluff, or I just don't, I'm not doing that. And anyway, I've had a good run. I want to be able to appreciate what I have had. I want to be able to be grateful. I've had it a lot better than a lot of people. Millions and millions of people, but even just people in journalism I've had it better than. So, I want to actually return to a place where I can feel that as the primary thing that I feel. And so cleaning helps me to get this stuff out of my kind of system. And I need money, need money. Next.
Okay, so let's turn to a slightly less dark tale from our film, shall we? When we first started shooting Karolina Miranda, she told us she was trying to cultivate her inner Cheech and Chong voice, as she put it. She was trying to write in a way that was actually like the way artists talk when they're together with one another, just smoking and drinking and that kind of thing. And leaving Time magazine allowed her to do that, to be herself. And it was that irreverent, insightful voice that caught the attention of the LA Times some years later. We were there with our cameras when she started that job at the LA Times, and through many of the ups and downs since. What I love about Karolina as a subject is that when the art world is zigging, she is off zagging somewhere completely different. When critics are rushing the biennials and big shows, she's exploring the art scene in Tijuana, a Cree jacket at a small museum, or the history of LA as seen through the architectural mashup of a Shell gas station. In contrast to Jen's story, which is unsettling and felt like something was really ending, Karolina's story points to what feels like it might be a more optimistic future. So I have another clip to show you. This one is, I think of it as a little bit more of a character sketch that will give you a sense of Karolina as a subject and her sort of promiscuous interests. It's almost 6 minutes, and for some reason in this room it's a little darker than other contexts, so I sort of apologize for that. And again, just keep in mind, it is a work in progress. All right, so let's look at this.
Technically, I'm a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times. That is my title. I do the Culture High and Low blog. I thought I was going to be independent the rest of my life. Like, I didn't really see myself taking a full-time job. It was a really delicious experience to be able to say exactly what was on my mind in a way that I wanted to say it. Every time I go out in this town, I see at least one thing that is just really interesting to me. I could be at the fancy galleries in Culver City every day, or I could also get out into different parts of the city. I went to the Autry recently and saw a Cree coat that was produced in 1900 that was emblazoned with the American flag all over it. Like, this was an incredibly moving work to see. You know, here's this exclusively indigenous piece of apparel that's laden with these symbols that you're not exactly sure how the craftsman or craftswoman intended them to be read. Were they symbols of subjugation? Was it somebody trying to take an emblem of power and therefore attain power themselves? Like, it was this really mysterious and beautiful and sad object. And so I feel like finding those things is just a matter of looking for them. Like, are you looking for them?
Me espera otro taxi, porque realmente estos gringos no hablan español y estoy dirigiendo yo. Aquí tienen todo picado, ¿ah?
What are you making? What is that?
That is like a new facade that is it resembles the first fence that divides Mexico and the U.S. In order for the people to think about those same issues that I think, that's why I make my pieces.
Sort of the art that we're interested in has shifted as a result of the election. You know, there are a lot of artists that have responded individually, whether it's via performance or, you know, putting up a statue of a naked Donald Trump, you know, in a public place. And I was less interested in those kind of direct responses than in thinking about how perhaps the election has changed the way we view art, that all of a sudden political art has become much more important, more relevant. Certainly in the circles I run in, there's a little less patience for the formalist, highly conceptual, look at this object, it's about the object and its objectness, you know? So that's what I'm thinking about when it comes to art in the age of Trump. How is it changing how we see things and how maybe a new generation of artists may be reacting to our own history or other histories? I had a pretty bizarre, atypical childhood. I was born in Wyoming of South American parents, as so many Latinos are. My father worked in heavy construction, so we moved around a lot, every 2 or 3 years, and that meant overseas assignments as well. So as a kid, I lived in the Middle East, I lived in Africa. We would spend long spells in Latin America if my dad was between contracts. But then Southern California was always the base. Southern California was home. I went through this period as a kid where I was like, I'm gonna be a novelist, and I had a little typewriter that my dad had picked up at a garage sale for like $5, like a little manual typewriter in the suitcase, and I would write little stories on little pieces of paper and then put them together like a book. I don't think I was cut out to be a novelist because I think real life is stranger than fiction sometimes, so I like writing about real life. I mean, I've always worried that my stay at the place is not for very long because A, I'm an art reporter, so yeah, I don't generate like 1 million clicks. I'm not writing stories about like Kim Kardashian's whatever. You know, in the wake of LAist and LA Weekly, it could be somebody who comes in and goes, I'm getting rid of the art section. We just hire some freelancers here and there to cover it. I'm just hoping I last long enough so I can finish the construction on my garage. What would I do? I don't know. I'd probably do some teaching, because I mean, could I survive? Maybe. I have a really important platform, and that it's perhaps one I shouldn't be walking away from at this time when I think we need forceful voices against some of the forces that are shaping our society. You know, I'm a bleeding heart liberal art writer who is also Latina and has a very different experience of what it means to be American than, say, other people in society. And do I really want to walk away from that soapbox? Let's see what we got.
So, after several years of following Jen, Karolina, and several other critics with our cameras, there were still questions I didn't have answers to. Basic things, even, like how many of us were left doing this work. So in 2017, during a year-long fellowship with the Nieman Foundation for Journalism, I went deeper into this research. I conducted a survey of visual arts writers and critics in the US. Many of our questions replicated those of a seminal study done 15 years prior by the National Arts Journalism Program at Columbia University under the leadership of Andres Santo, who was an advisor for our survey. I actually remember filling out that questionnaire myself. Google was sort of still new, Facebook was not yet a thing. So the existence of this study was gold for us. It meant we had this rare opportunity for a before and after snapshot of this incredible period of change. We received 327 responses to our survey from writers who work for publications from Teen Vogue to the Tampa Tribune, from the New York Times to the New Inquiry. So let's just start with a few numbers. We love to think of critics as the dodo birds of the art world, and we talk a lot about how few of us there are. It is incredibly common to see reports that say, the number of staff critics left in America is 20 or 8 or 6, and honestly, I never know where any of these numbers come from. When the 2002 study was done, most major media outlets, and especially major newspapers, had art critics. We don't need studies to tell us that the losses since then are dramatic. Still, there are more of us than some might imagine. More than 75 individuals in more than 20 states described themselves as the chief art critic or equivalent at their publication. Of those, more than 25 hold positions at a staff position at a newspaper, a count we know to be incomplete, so that number is actually higher. And the field is gathering new voices. Arts writers who've been working for a decade or less, but who have made it sort of past that critical 2-year mark, represented 47% of our survey's respondents. As for art itself, our survey tells us that today's arts writers are optimistic about art today. Most believe that artists are breaking genuinely new ground. 8 in 10 are focused principally on contemporary art. Only 10 people out of 327 care enough about the market to focus on it regularly. The survey respondents also told us that they're interested in art being made beyond the art capitals of New York and Los Angeles, and believe that artists elsewhere are often overlooked. For me, though, one of the most important takeaways of our survey is about the specific artists most worthy of our ink today. Some of the most relevant art being produced today is being made by artists of color and indigenous artists. We asked survey respondents to name up to 3 artists they believed were worthy of being championed. This resulted in a very long list of more than 400 artists that tended heavily towards artists of color and indigenous artists. It's especially telling to see who showed up near the top of that list. Artists like the Post-Commodity Collective, who brought an indigenous perspective to the border debates with their repellent fence a few years ago. Or Kara Walker, shown here with her steam-powered caravan in New Orleans that plays songs of Black protest. And Carrie James Marshall, known for being sort of a contemporary old master who brings Black subjects into the art historical canon. Other artists near the top of this list also are Hank Willis Thomas, LaToya Ruby Frazier, and Annika Yee. If these are the artists we are interested in now, consider where we were just 15 years prior. When the 2002 study was done, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg were the favorite living artists among critics, post-war heavyweights and white men. That's a big change. We also asked survey respondents to reflect on the previous decade of art exhibitions and tell us which shows had most influenced their thinking on art. Here again, what shows up near the top of the list is quite telling. Solo shows that came up often include, once again, Carrie James Marshall, Mastery, the retrospective of Colombian sculptor Doris Salcedo, and the performance exhibit of Marina Abramovic, The Artist is Present. Group shows frequently mentioned include 30 Americans, a showcase of contemporary African American art, seen here in Milwaukee, and We Wanted a Revolution, which featured the work of Black women artists during the emergence of second wave feminism. And I just love this piece by Betty Saar. It's just like the most potent little object. So what we're seeing in these findings is a heightened interest in artists who are provoking a moment of cultural reckoning in one way or another, and work that explores issues of racial, sexual, and historical identity. I love the way Janae Osterhelt, a culture columnist for the Boston Globe and a fellow Nieman Fellow, described this shift. In an interview for our documentary, she said, "Our idea of art and what art should be has changed." Or consider how Marcel Polednik, the director of the Milwaukee Art Museum, put it. She said, "What we're learning in real time, along with the rest of the world, and hoping, is that this is really a turning point in history." A natural question to ask in view of this shift and hoped-for turning point is this: do today's critics, broadly speaking, have the capacities to engage today's best artists, formally, culturally, and politically? In some really important ways, our survey shows us that the field of criticism stands in contrast to these things. Consider that in the climate of Black Lives Matter, Decolonize This Place, and protests at Standing Rock, as art institutions across the country are rethinking whom they hire and how the story of art gets told, those with the most power to shape conversations on art today are a small group of critics who are all white. The 6 critics with the most influence, according to our survey, are, ranked in order, Roberta Smith of the New York Times, Jerry Saltz of New York Magazine, Holland Cotter, also of the Times, Peter Sheldall of the New Yorker, Ben Davis of ArtNet, and Christopher Knight of the Los Angeles Times. All of these critics are white. 5 of them are men. 5 are based in New York City, and 5 have been working in the field for 25 years or more. I think it goes without saying that these are all absolutely essential, relevant voices on art. Their words have meant so much to me. The writing of Peter Sheldall is just kind of spectacular. I have such envy for it. And Roberta's kind of reduction sauce of criticism, every sentence does so much work in her writing. I admire every one of these critics. But one can reasonably ask, does this circle of 6 represent a limited perspective? In a recent opinion piece, let's see, am I getting this right? Okay. Did you all just see pictures of the critics just now? Okay, good. In a recent opinion piece published by the New York Times and utilizing our survey, Elizabeth Mendez-Berry and Chiwei Yang of Critical Minded, a project of the Nathan Cummings Foundation and the Ford Foundation, asked, quite controversially, whether some of these old school critics should in fact step aside, perhaps taking on some kind of an emeritus role to make room for new voices. It's a good question, and one worth asking not only on the national level, but on a local one too. There is one finding about influence, though, that I do want to pause and celebrate. The most influential critic is Roberta Smith, and no one came even close. Her recognition is significant, given how rarely female critics are celebrated. There was much lamenting last year when the Pulitzer for criticism went to her husband, Jerry Saltz, rather than to her. Some writers even likened it to Hillary's loss in 2016. Indeed, Richard Nixon was president the last time a female visual art critic won the Pulitzer Prize, and that was Emily Genauer in 1974. 2 women came within spitting distance of Roberta, and I'd like to mention them too. They were Gillian Steinhauer, herself a frequent contributor to the New York Times these days, and Karolina. So all of this begs the question, what will the field of criticism look like in another 15 years? Our survey hints at that too. The critics with less than 25 years in the field who are also considered influential in our survey do not fit the mold of their forerunners at all. These are writers like Harag, Karolina, and Gillian, who I've already mentioned, and also writers like Hannah Black, Patty Johnson, Hito Sturell, Claudia LaRocco, Antoine Sargent, and Maggie Nelson, to name a few. These critics are as likely to write about late-stage capitalism as they are the Whitney Biennial or a revamped MoMA. They write broadly about society, addressing ideas that happen to surface through contemporary art. They also don't derive their authority from the prestige of their publication, but rather from their name and their distinctive points of view. As a group, they represent a much more varied picture of what criticism can be. And this leads me to another point of optimism. We are living through an incredibly inventive time for arts writing. There has been an explosion of forms in recent years, with experimentation happening kind of out on the fringes, outside of mainstream and traditional media. As Charlotte Frost, the author of the book Art Criticism Online, argues, this is actually kind of bringing us back to our roots. After all, the 800-word art review is a pretty new thing. If you go back to sort of the Paris salons of the 18th century, for example, there was a whole range of creative responses to art. The survey led me to weeks of deep, pleasurable research about these new and inventive forms, including working my way through a rather tall stack of books by writers such as Ben Lerner, Maggie Nelson, Teju Cole, and Hilton Als. What I discovered in this research was a broad range of projects that bear resemblances to things like memoir, fiction, stand-up comedy, Tumblr manifestos, and all sorts of other things. The production values tend to be high, the thinking dense, and the writing sometimes quite personal. And in so many of these cases, there is something about these projects that makes seriousness about art approachable. The collective known as DIS has, for example, created a Netflix-like channel for heady shows on art. One recent show had the subtitle, "From Courbet to the Kardashians." They call it genre non-conforming TV. Triple Canopy was another favorite that came up. People love to root for Triple Canopy. It publishes collections of high-concept research projects that sort of resist the internet's speed by unfurling slowly over the course of months online. And then there's Black Contemporary Art, a Tumblr showcasing art by and about people of African descent. It has presented thousands of artworks since its founding by Kimberly Drew in 2011. It's a very internet way of doing criticism. It makes arguments with images that accumulate over time and in a way that define a point of view. So, between these two projects, the documentary film and the survey, a broader picture has started to emerge for me. As Melissa quoted earlier, it isn't just that the art world has changed, with hashtag-driven discourses, a proliferation of biennials, long lines for Instagrammable art shows, and mind-boggling art market records. It's that art's place in the world has changed. Consider that the once rare tools of the artists are in all of our hands, a mere swipe or a click away. The planet at large is expressing itself, and it's doing it on a scale that's hard to fathom. Not everything spilling through our Instagram feeds and everyday lives is art, of course, but some of it is. There is suddenly a lot more visual culture to contend with, and in places we might not expect. It seems entirely likely to me that more great art is being made today than at any time in human history, but that it is also difficult to find and indeed to see. All of this makes the job of discerning what's genuinely artful, what's worthy of our collective attention, the path-finding role of the critic, as important as it's ever been. But critics don't always connect. One of the telling themes in all of this research, and especially in the documentary, is the soul-crushing nature of the numbers game, the struggle to capture and hold an audience. Let's face it, the web favors certain virtues over others. Wit, weirdness, bombast, and urgency among them. In real time, we have witnessed critics watch their well-crafted essays evaporate almost on contact with the internet, or sink to its depths like a stone. A few years back, as our cameras rolled inside the Houston Chronicle newsroom, Douglas Britt darted from one editor's desk to another, trying to understand his analytics and why one of his blog posts seemed to be bombing. Douglas was getting married that night in a strip club as a form of criticism. His story is very complicated, and I can't actually summarize it for you right now, but we are committed to telling it in full in the documentary. But in short, what he was trying to do was get a national conversation going about an artwork that he believed was tone deaf to issues of gay marriage at that time. So, a few days after Douglas got married at Tony's Corner Pocket in Houston, and after I had packed up my cameras and gone back to Milwaukee, Douglas went out and bought himself a camera, and he kept shooting. He eventually had a psychological break of sorts. He disappeared for a while, and he lost his position as a result. We caught up with him weeks later in a Chicago hotel room, where he spoke movingly and quite eloquently about how hard it is to be interesting enough today. For him, this lack of audience took a real toll. This is one of the core questions our documentary will ask. What kind of audience can criticism expect in the future? So I want to share with you one last clip. This one is akin to an extended trailer. Again, it's a work in progress, so keep that in mind, but it should give you a sense of the themes that we're pursuing in our film. But before I play this, I hope you will give me the briefest of moments to put up on the screen the names of individuals who worked on the doc and the survey with me. It represents many years of work in the case of the doc and more than a year in the case of the survey. I want to thank the 326 other visual arts writers who took the time to complete our survey and the critics who've allowed us into their lives with our cameras. And since he's here tonight, I would also like to thank the former editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Marty Kaiser, who gave me the best job I'll ever have. He's right over there. Damn straight. All right, so let's play this thing, shall we? You ready?
I don't know what this is. I think I might like it. I don't have any explanation why, because it might be really bad. I can't tell.
Everyone I talk to on a one-on-one basis is usually very interested in art. They feel alienated from contemporary art, like somehow there's a secret they're not getting yet.
The art world is definitely bullshit. I mean, I don't want to imply that all artists are bullshit, but it has a lot of bullshit.
Well, the power invests in me. I am still currently employed as a Houston Chronicle art critic. I declare that this piece sucks.
Art criticism means nothing to the average person on the street. And artworks can, could, should, would. There's so much that you can get from a really incredible artwork that utterly shifts your experience of the world.
The subtlest stuff is some of the most beautiful, but then you also get not subtle and fireworks. And I mean, you sort of have it all in here.
When I came here 11 years ago, there were 4 full-time critics just in Seattle, and there was one at the Oregonian. I believe there's now just me, and that means there's now 0.
Small and medium-sized newspapers are looking at the possibility of extinction.
The downside of mid-sized and small American cities not having arts reported is that they're going to be more marginalized in the conversation.
If the whole American discourse about the arts is controlled by 6 people in New York City, that's a limited perspective.
If they're the only ones with the power to define something, you are taking away power from other people.
I sometimes have these moments where I'm like, am I taking crazy feminist pills? I don't understand why no one is seeing this thing.
As much as we like to moan and groan about the death of art criticism, this maybe is also a reason to be excited about new voices coming in, about these new ways of presenting it.
We're at the cusp of a particular moment where there is this rise of forces like hyperallergic.
The role of the critic has changed. A lot of this technology is so new, it's still the chaos of the wave crashing. We haven't quite figured it out yet.
I think that there is a Facebookification, a Twitterification of art. Something that spreads really virally through the internet is seldom something that really makes you think.
people like to think of art as purely being about good and somehow neutral, but art is never neutral.
Our idea of art and what art should be has changed.
My beat is value. Deep discussion and dialogue and conflict about what we value.
This work is for the people. And if it's not for the people, what are we doing?
Okay, so at the start of this talk, I told you about that story that lured me to Milwaukee. It turned out to be a really great story with a pretty spectacular cliffhanger near the end. A problem emerged with the museum's signature element, that flapping roof I was telling you about. The building was all but complete, the mechanical gears positioned atop the steeply pitched glass hall. That's when the engineers acknowledged their terrible mistake. The sunshade would be too heavy for the building. This could have been a story of massive disaster for the architect, the museum, and the city itself. But in the end, the architect, Santiago Calatrava, re-engineered the sunshade from scratch. And one September afternoon, 90 tons of steel lifted off of glass with a whisper. The Milwaukee Art Museum captured headlines around the world and forever changed the city's relationship to art. It was so transformative that in a very real way, no one really needs to make a case for culture in Wisconsin in the same way anymore. It seems more self-evident now. Still, that doesn't mean that art or writing about art can be sustained in a place like Wisconsin. Just try making the case for criticism, which is really about the role of the artist and the extent to which we're committed to their value, with a newspaper editor in 2019. That, in fact, became my story. Earlier this year, my newspaper, which made space for what I do longer than many, eliminated my job as the art and architecture critic in a system-wide downsizing by Gannett. I am still seeking answers to some of the questions I listed at the top of this talk, the questions that are propelling all of the research that I've been doing. On the one hand, it feels like criticism is out of step today with our time and collapsing at a critical moment when beliefs about kids in cages can be formed at museums and monuments. But I also see evidence here that criticism is being remade before our eyes. And I'm excited about the inventive, path-finding voices who are creating a generational shift and taking us in new directions. Thank you very much for listening.
You can pass them over, or I will take them as well, and we will read them. Do you want to read them out?
Why don't you read them?
Okay. Do you want me to? I'll take them.
Okay. Oh, here you go, Gloria.
Oh, thank you. We'll start with a quick, easy one. What has happened to the people featured in your documentary?
Okay. Jen very interestingly, kind of, like I said, she sort of left the art world for a while and social media for like a solid year. And she decided to go back to school and become a psychologist. So she's doing anti-suicide work, I believe, and she has a counseling practice in Seattle now. So that's what she's doing. Karolina's still at the LA Times. Harag is now, had just started this term, invented this term blogazine when we started. Now he runs Hyperallergic, which is one of the most kind of influential websites for arts writing in the country today. And let's see, who else? Douglas. Oh yes, so Douglas, he is an artist. He's done some art shows since all of this happened, and he continues to write about art and is doing kind of a performative art practice that's kind of difficult to explain, but it's, I think he would describe it as sex work. So he's kind of combined sex work and travel and arts writing. So very interesting, complicated story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have the cost of technological advances to arts writing outweighed the benefits like new tools, techniques, or forms to create novel art? Any ways and new ways to share art?
I don't know the answer to that. I think the jury is out, right? I mean, as I said, I was I was a true believer on the digital turn in the beginning. I loved social media. I was on it early. I used video very early. I do think that there are, I think about the way that a video camera can actually be used as a form of, as a tool of criticism. Like that is something that has not been explored that deeply. So yes, these tools are creating all of these different ways that we can kind of think about what criticism is. But again, it's a mixed bag. A lot of these projects don't end up actually having much of an audience because of kind of where they sit in the digital world. I remember, just a quick thing, like I remember one day, years ago, I used to post things on Facebook and like it was an instant uptick for my stories. And over time that, like there would be days when Facebook would just like turn the volume completely down on what I was doing, and those numbers were not reliable after a while. And then there were these days where I'd like post an art review and I'd see like right next to it on social media like this crazy video with a dolphin and a cat like becoming friends or something, right? And you realize like the competition that the environment in which you're competing, it's really tough. And like I actually looked at the dolphin and the cat, and it's like there's something really beautiful about some of these like interspecies love videos we see. Like there's a lot of great stuff, right? But criticism is sometimes quiet and subtle and slow, and in that environment it doesn't always fare well. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Do you see a difference between art criticism and smaller or large local publications such as the New York Times, the LA Times, the Milwaukee Sentinel, et cetera, and art criticism in Art Forum or Hyperallergic?
Sure. So Art Forum would be kind of the classic place for the more academic, scholarly, philosophical forms of criticism. And, I will defend that kind of criticism to the end. Like, I think that it does have a coded language that does keep a lot of people out. But it is also, like Michelle Grabner, who I mentioned earlier, her work and her criticism falls very much into that camp. But it's as much about really relevant issues as kind of a more popular criticism. These are people who are dealing with issues of what is truth, what is fake, and they're very serious about it. And so that is how I would sort of describe that end of the spectrum. But I do think that journalistic critics are I think, a little bit more important these days. Like, I think they're having a moment. And, you know, part of the difference is that you actually need to do reporting in order to do criticism, which is like kind of verboten for kind of more academically trained critics. So I'll give you an example. When the Donnell Wolford controversy broke several Whitney biennials back, there was a white artist who had basically created a piece under the guise of the name of a black woman, and he had women who performed his piece in the biennial. It was very controversial, that a white man would kind of present his work as that. And the internet was like crazy about this. People were opining left and right. But nobody called the black artists until Karolina did, and did the reporting. And so she was able to bring, that reporting informed her judgment. And I do think that that is allowed today, and perhaps needed today too. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more, and I feel like this is related to what you were just talking about, what happens when more small regional cities no longer have art critics as part of their staff on their small regional newspapers?
Yeah, well, I have in my city where I live, I don't worry about, like, artists are really good at creating audiences for each other in places like Milwaukee. Like, there are shows where audiences are really almost kind of hand-built. People develop their own communities, and they don't really need me in the same sense. But what does happen is you don't get a woman from, the suburbs with the newspaper under her arm going into an art gallery to see art and maybe becoming eventually a collector. So there's a very meaningful audience for art that will not go away, but that broader audience that can be brought in through the power of a newspaper, even still today, there will be a hit there. So I think that's probably what happens.
Well, thank you so much, Mary Louise. Thank you all for coming, and please join us in the courtyard for a reception.